This is Paul Morrissey, the director of Mixed Blood. This is one of my favorite films with my favorite actress of all time, Marilia Péra from Brazil. Richard Ulacia from Cuba came over on a Mariel boat in the early 80s. Linda Kerridge from Australia. Then Angel David was Puerto Rican, grew up in New York. Geraldine Smith, who was also a New Yorker, Irish, Italian. Ulrich Berr, who was from Germany. And finally, Rodney Harvey, who was also Irish, Italian, from Philadelphia. These were the main actors, and I began the film in the Lower East Side, where the drug dealing was out in the open. Kids were in gangs doing the drugs, and I made up a story about a woman who had a son who was a little bit deficient, mentally perhaps, but was a good defender for her and her gang. The gang was made up of underage kids, and unfortunately, on this film, I have no outtakes, no scenes deleted. I think I did not photograph one scene that I didn't use. Every scene I photographed, I used, and I don't remember cutting much out except double takes of the same material. The film was all scripted. There was no improvisation. I worked with a wonderful writer named Alan Bown, who had previously worked on a play he wrote called 40 Deuce, which is also one of my favorite films. He was extraordinary for dialogue. He had an incredible gift in everything he did of writing naturalistic dialogue for kids and tough guys and ethnic people. He was a wonderful writer who also worked on Spike of Bensonhurst for me, Mixed Blood, and 40 Deuce. I had luckily preserved maybe 100 production stills in color and black and white. And also, I was given at the end of the film the script girls' Polaroids, which were done as a way of keeping track of what actors wore, what shirts and trousers that day, in case I should have to photograph them again another day in the same scene. I never did. Every scene I did was completed quickly, and I never went back and rephotographed any section for any scene. But that's why these Polaroids exist. I think they're kind of interesting. They're all informal. There's no performance going on in a Polaroid as there is in a scene still. And they just give you a little extra picture of some of the kids and some of the people who appeared in the film. And films are always only movies. They're only pretending. And sometimes it's nice just to see people when they're just having their picture taken so that the script girl can keep a record of what they're wearing that day. Anyway, this is a film I really am really fond of. I love the music. I was able to use whatever music I wanted. I used these great Caribbean artists like Hector Lavoe from Puerto Rico, or Wilfredo Vargas, Willie Colon, Calixto Ochoa, and a wonderful composer from Argentina who wrote the main theme song, which is called Amanecer, which means dawn. All this music I found in Hispanic neighborhoods where they sold cassettes of this kind of music, and I just fell in love with it, and I tried to put as much of it behind the scenes as I could. The scenes of the outdoor drug dealing were taken right out of the real scenes that were going on in East Village, things I read about in the newspaper. I had no trouble making up the story. I gave my story to Alan Bown, and he wrote so much of the dialogue. Then I amended the dialogue and make it a little bit shorter or change it a little bit. And it went right before the camera, and I like the results. Working so independently as I always did, I never had to submit my material to a producer or an agent or anybody and get any feedback or input. Didn't want any. I wanted what came off the top of my head, what Alan Bound was able to come up with instantaneously. I always wanted the actors to come right away with something that they would do. I wasn't going to plan it. I wasn't going to suggest what they do. I knew that they would have enough sense about them, enough wits about them to bring a certain life to whatever I gave them to do. The system of making films in Hollywood and most independent films is a grueling kind of forced march for the person who wants to make the film, having to work for year in, year out with the people who are going to give them the money so they can approve of everything, think that it's right, think that it's right for their audience or some audience. And even if they get to make the film, these independent film companies, like the big companies themselves, they run it off in shopping malls to ask kids surveys of what the kids would like, who they don't like, what kind of music they like. It's a miracle that any films come out that have any kind of quality. A few do, but most of them don't. In the case of Mixed Blood, the music was so vital, and the thought occurred to me at some point, it was kind of obvious, that the music from countries that have very poor standard of living, like most of the countries in the Caribbean, or even the poor countries in Africa, are so positive and upbeat and melodious and musical and fun and enjoyable. And the music that came from America for the past 40 or 50 years is not only moaning and whining and not beautiful, but nowadays it's actually filled with hatred and violence and hideous ugliness and stupidity. And all this is applauded by the media because they accept anything that comes down the pike if they think kids are buying it because they're afraid to lose their demographics for their advertisers. So the music of affluent America and affluent Europe is this hateful rock and roll that's just screaming and humping and jumping and screwing and vomiting and out sounds, and the performers can't stand still. They're making faces and jumping and writhing and in agony as if they're in terminal crack poisoning. Yet the music that comes from Mexico or Puerto Rico or Cuba or any of these countries that are so poor is filled with positive things, upbeat things, and enjoyable things, and they get away from the problems, while the affluent nations which have no problems create problems for their poor kids with their hateful popular culture. And I thought this was an element that I wasn't going to say it like I'm saying it now, but it was inherent in the attitudes of the story, which is not a fun story really, and the sound of the music that's played behind the story. And this type of juxtaposition is something I thought was interesting. Because the film is so funny and really hilarious in parts and sometimes seems like a farce, a lot of people think I exaggerated the real situation, and this could not be further from the truth. Almost everything that looks so extreme I read about in the newspapers and, as it happens, on the front page of the New York Times. The impetus for this film, for me, came from reading on the front page of that newspaper in July 18th, 1982, a headline that said, "City seeks to dislodge drug trade by demolishing tenement havens. A multi-million-dollar heroin and cocaine industry on Lower East Side flourishing openly in vacant city-owned buildings that drug dealers have converted into private fortresses has grown so intractable that New York City plans to begin tearing down the buildings. The illegal drug trade has served neighborhood addicts and buyers from out of state, and $100 million a year has changed hands, according to police estimates. Police say the Lower East Side neighborhood may now have become the busiest center of heroin and cocaine trafficking. This is the retail drug capital of the world," said the commander of a special street narcotics squad. "To get the buildings torn down is a priority. At the area's heart East 3rd Street has become a free trade zone for drugs. In the light of afternoon the other day, one man leaned out of a third-floor window to hoist up a rope on which a shopping bag dangled. He took money out, put in a parcel, and lowered the bag out the window to a waiting customer below. Drug dealers have occupied 20 to 30 city-owned abandoned buildings by breaking concrete and metal seals. They install layers of steel doors within the building to resist the police, and they construct elaborate tunnels in the bowels of the buildings that enable them to escape and to hide their drugs when the police do break their way in. The police say local youths can earn $90 a day by working as steerers, guiding customers to the building where a particular type of heroin or cocaine is sold. On a recent visit to one building, there, in a ceiling-high brick wall with a small crack in it, the drug deal operates much like a bank teller. The customer's money moves through the crack in the bricks, and the drugs are slid back out. The customers never see the dealer. Some buildings gross as much as $20,000 daily, the police estimate. It's the number one growth industry on the Lower East Side. The neighborhood addicts, particularly in summer, like to shoot up outdoors. They offer all their dependence upon drugs, fearless, open, and bold, as they gather outdoors by an old tar wall on Eldridge Street. The debris of their days could be seen at their feet: discarded syringes, bottle caps and matches, garbage and filth. On the tar wall was a handwritten sign advertising the paraphernalia used to inject heroin. Works for rent, $2. When a reporter approached, some outdoor addict smiled or nodded or stared blankly, all the while tying rubber hoses around their arms. Then they or the dealer plunged the needle in. 4 of the addicts, interviewed by a reporter, said they had little fear the police would arrest them. "We make good arrests," said the commander of Manhattan South, which includes the Lower East Side, "but nobody goes to jail." Nearby residents say the despair and devastation of their neighborhood is so overwhelming that they no longer think the sight of addicts shooting up in public is unusual. The other day, a steerer sat on Rivington Street tenement steps, his eyes down, wearing a white hat. When the police drove off, the steerer jumped up and motioned all clear, and the flock hidden within the walls came out. Buyers lined up in front of the building to make purchases, and within minutes the crowd had attracted as well the hot dog vendor from down the street. The hot dog vendor was one of the few things I read about that I left out. I probably forgot it. I did a little more newspaper reading the next 2 years before I actually got to make the film. I read about how the gangs down there were composed mainly of very young kids who could kill people and not go to jail, who there was no real punishment because they were juvenile offenders. That interested me. There were other articles about how many young kids were being killed and how small funeral parlors had sprung up all over the East Village, doing most of their business, or a lot of their business, with burying teenagers who were shot in these drug wars. All this seemed to me an interesting story because of the fact that it was going on, it was known, it was in front of everybody, it was on the front page of the biggest newspaper. And my angle on it was, isn't it interesting that nobody cares? Nothing is done about it. It's not a situation to be taken seriously to me. No modern situation is, because today's day and age you can change things if you want to, but nobody really wants to. What interested me was it was a kind of foolish and funny situation, the way these things went on and nothing was done about them. It was the material, as usual, from my mind, material for comedy. But any of these details about the drug trade, the Lower East Side, the kid gangs, are information you'd get in journalism. Journalism put on film is hardly interesting, never interesting to me. A lot of people do a kind of journalism reporting in films and stories. Any movie or story has to be about characters, and any movie story or any story has to be about characters. And regardless of the story itself, the characters are the main ingredient. Unless it's their story set against the background of drugs or Lower East Side or whatever you're doing, you don't have a good movie. I tried to invent and think up some strange characters. And the girl who played the prostitute in Pichote, Marilia Péra, the actress from Brazil, I thought was the most extraordinary actress I had seen in those years. And even now, nobody has ever given a performance like she gave in Pichote. And it dawned on me that maybe she'd be available for a crazy story set in Lower East Side. Luckily, I was invited to a film festival in Sao Paulo right around that year, 83, 84, I guess. And she was there appearing in a play. I arranged to meet her, asked her if she'd like to be in a film. She said she'd love to. I said, can you speak English? She said, not so well, but I'll learn by the time I have to get there. I took her word for it. She couldn't have been nicer. She was starring in a play, an English drawing room comedy. She was her own producer. She directed the plays. She had been working in the theater since she was 3 or 4 years old with her parents, who were theater actors. She was an extraordinary woman and still is, never stops performing. In Brazil, I asked her, after her success where she won a Best Actress Award from the Society of Film Critics or something like that, if she had any offers from American producers or directors to be in a film, and she said no, she had none. I thought that was kind of incredible because I was making a very low-budget film, and she was willing to do it. She was adventurous. But the fact that she wasn't in the mix of Hollywood agents and managers and wasn't available for these meetings in Hollywood left her out of films. So all the sort of hardworking, career people who go to meetings and sit in Hollywood and work with their agents keep working all the time, and extraordinary talents like Marilia Péra, who should be working as much in American films as any other films, are treated as if they didn't exist. And it's part of I think, the great failure of American movies, that they keep using the same dreary actors over and over, especially the independent films that come from lists of actors that are acceptable to foreign sales agents or acceptable to agents for packages. And they exclude young people, they exclude people from other countries, they exclude people with accents, and their vision is so narrow and limited, and the movies show it. There's, to my mind, a lack of life in so many American movies. Certainly Marilia Péra, in any film she takes part in, brings an enormous amount of vitality, life, unique attributes of personality and character. Anything you ask of her, she'll give you. I was really lucky that she agreed to do it. After that, I thought, well, what exactly will she play? I thought she'd play a mother of a guy who's like a gangster, and that they were living in the Lower East Side, which was a ghetto, or in European terms, it would be called a Casbah. And so the story from Pepe Le Moco came into my mind about a gangster who rules a neighborhood called the Casbah in Morocco, I guess, and never leaves it. And when he finally does leave it, because of a beautiful woman played by Hedy Lamarr in the Charles Boyer American version, dies when he leaves the Casbah. So this sort of strange structure, which was in my head from the Pepe Le Moco film, which was called Algiers when it came and was done in America in 1939. I borrowed elements of that, but I made Pepe Le Moco have a mother. I cast a young Brazilian boy when I met in Sao Paulo at the time, as soon as I knew I had her. And he was a soccer player and mainly a model, but he had a gigantic personality, and he was very outgoing. And I asked him if he'd come to New York at the same time. He said, sure, whenever you want. But a year or so went by, and I was about to start the film. I reached him, and I said, we're ready to go. Can you come? And he said something had happened. He was about to go to Japan and play soccer, and in Japan, they had this stupid, ridiculous rule that said nobody could play amateur soccer if they had ever worked as a model or an actor or had any kind of job connected with show business. So he said if the people in Japan who were bringing them there to play on a team, which was an amateur team, which you had to play on before you could get to professional, he would lose his eligibility. And he said he'd give it up if I really wanted him to. I said, no, don't do that. Go play soccer. And so within 2 weeks of starting the film, when I expected him to come, I even tried to talk to the Japanese ambassador and see if they could bend the rules, and they said no. I had to recast the film. My casting agent had brought in Richard Ulacia as a small part, and I met him with a few others. I couldn't understand a word he said. I even suspected he was possibly Chinese. I knew he was from Cuba, but he was really hard to understand anything he said. The agent said, could you use him in a small part? I said, well, he's so extraordinary looking. He'd be so distracted if he stood next to somebody and he didn't have anything to do. Then I lost the Brazilian boy, and the agent suggested I meet this Cuban again because he had come back into the casting agent's office and he could understand him. And he said that the first time he was so nervous that he couldn't speak in a way that was understandable. I met him again. I realized he was perfectly understandable to me, but it was an incredible accent. I took some still pictures of him. As soon as I took a still picture of him, I saw he had a kind of dramatic quality. He was totally different than the kind of kid he was replacing, so I just shifted the story. Instead of a dominating son who dominates his mother, I just said, oh, it's better if the mother dominates the son, and he is looks like the type that needs dominating because he has this speech problem. And I went with him, and I was glad I did. So many people who saw the film said he wasn't a regular actor and you couldn't understand him. And I said, well, he was very good for me. He had a strange quality. He was different than anybody else I'd ever met. And I liked the fact that he was hard to understand. Why does everybody have to understand every word said by every actor in a movie? I don't think you have to do that. Anyway, that's how that boy got cast. The rest of the young kids came through agents who represented breakdancers who rented kids from Puerto Rico and Spanish Harlem. They rented them out to shopping malls for breakdancing events where they get a few dollars. But there were no agents that represented Hispanics in 1984. It was very hard to find Hispanics. I wound up using Rodney Harvey, who was just a 15-year-old kid, Irish-Italian from Pennsylvania. He didn't make sense in a Hispanic gang, but I realized he had a wonderful personality, and I decided to just throw him in the gang and not make any explanation for it. He was really a wonderful performer. He went on to a lot of other things later. Linda Kerridge I knew, and I thought she'd make a good kind of Hedy Lamarr, who would bring the lead actor out of the Casbah, as it were. Alphabet City, Lower East Side ghetto. I decided to make it a kind of stew of every nationality I could find. Again, nobody was making films as Hispanics in those days. I'd always wanted to do it, and I was glad I had this opportunity, and I had this wonderful leading actress, Marilia Péra. I really liked making the movie, and if it wasn't for Alan Sard, the great French producer, who I told him a few sentences of the story. I said, it's about this area where the drugs are sold. And he said, oh, good, let's do it. And he never read the script. He just said, how much do you want? I asked for a small amount of money so I could use whoever I wanted. He said yes. I turned the film in. He liked it. Everywhere it was shown, it got good reviews. And it just didn't get big distribution. In America, it went with a very small distributor who wasn't able to book theaters because he couldn't bring big dollars for the advertising. And wherever it went, I was happy it was so well received. But unless you have a lot of distribution and a lot of advertising dollars behind your film, you can't get theaters and you can't tell people to go to see it. Doing it your own way is not a good idea because you're totally outside of the system, and the system resents that, and so does the critics in a funny way. They kind of patronize people who go outside the system and have enormous respect for the people who play the tens and 20 and 30 and $100 million game of American film production. And I don't recommend it to anybody doing their own thing, but I was foolish enough to do it. Mixed Blood was, again, for better or worse, my own thing.